Well, good evening, everyone. It's so great to be here with you all. Thank you, Dr. Stern, for that very warm welcome. And I see many familiar faces in the crowd. I see one of my mentors and elders, Dr. Sarah James, in the back from Vajranko. I see Dr. Peter Wesley, our colleague in Tamamta. Where did Peter go? Okay, right in front. Thank you, Peter. Isaac, our Tamamta tutor, statistics tutor in the back, and Janessa Newman, a Tamamta fellow. I'm going to miss someone. Sue McHenry, my advisor from 20 years ago. It's so good to be here. Mark Lockwood, my really good friend. Thank you all so much for being here. If I missed you, I'm sorry, but it's so good to spend the evening with you all. We're going to be talking about Tamamta this evening, and Tamamta is a Sugpiaq and Yupik word meaning all of us. We were grateful to work with some Sugpiaq elders and scholars who helped us name this program, but also gifted it to us. And in this picture, you'll see many of our Tamamta fellows 2 years ago at Howard Luke's Galilee Spirit Camp, and this we'll talk a little bit about what we were doing in this picture, but I just want to recognize that word Tamamta, in fact, when many Yupik people use the word, they use their hands in a circle, and it really does mean all of us transforming with Western and Indigenous fisheries and marine sciences together. Thank you for the land acknowledgement, Sarah and Dr. Stern. I wanted to share with you all that I am from Gwich'âjê, Fort Yukon, which is up in the northeast corner of Alaska, but I also grew up on Lower Tanana Dene lands in Tagatili or Nenana, and I just want to recognize that anywhere you go is Indigenous lands, and we are on the unceded lands of the Lower Tanana Dene peoples, and this particular campus, Troth Yadet, has a very, very significant meaning. It was a traditional gathering place to gather wild troth or wild potato up specifically near the museum, and hopefully soon you'll also see the Troth Yadet Indigenous Studies Center right next to the museum. And so a lot of cultural, social significance, and I want to honor Lower Tanana Dene peoples for their past, present, and future stewardship.
And hello, everyone. It's so good to be here with Dr. Black. I'm Courtney Carothers, and we'll be introducing ourselves a little bit in a minute. But I wanted to share, I've come from Degayakuk or Anchorage, Alaska, where I'm a white settler making my life and raising my family on Dena'ina land. So really want to acknowledge their long-term stewardship where I'm making my life. And I lived here. It's so nice to be back on Troth Yadet campus. It's so nice to see the sign as you come onto campus that says Troth Yadet. I lived here 2008 to 2014 or so, and there wasn't just something as simple as a sign says so much. On some level it seems simplistic, but it's such a deep recognition of whose lands we're on and why that's important. I also want to acknowledge, I first came to Alaska via Sugpiaq lands on the Kodiak Archipelago. I was invited to live with Mary Hawkinson, the late Mary Hawkinson. She passed away a couple of years ago in the village of Old Harbor. And so I really came to start my place and family and relationality in Alaska via Kodiak and the Sugpiaq people. So I want to acknowledge them as well for kind of opening my eyes to what had been closed and really welcoming me here to be a settler in these lands. So thank you.
Yeah, and so we wanted to situate ourselves within the context of this talk and this research. And interestingly, I've had to reflect a lot on this growing up in the village as a Native person, but also this role that I carry as a researcher and a scientist in examining my own positionality. So I just want to recognize that I come to this work in full recognition of the colonial harms of research and seek to transform that from being more extractive in nature and one that is alongside Indigenous communities, including my own, and giving back. And I would say that the intellectual guidance of our elders that we've been working with, Gwich'in and Lower Tanana Dene elders, Atna Elder Wilson Justin, Yupik Elder Dr. Mike Williams, Unangang, Sugpiaq, Yupik, and Dana scholars, leaders, and fishermen, students, thanking them for their knowledge, expertise, and guidance as we go about this work. And what I will say is that a lot of this work is relational. So, we spend a lot of time introducing ourselves to you because this work we come to is in a relational way. And so that we can ensure that the work that we are doing is very relevant and needed and in community. Just a little bit about myself. Dr. Stern did a nice job of introducing me, but Shojri Jessica Blackoji Gwachaje Gwatsan Ihli Ga Tanan Gwichi. I'm Jessica. My family's from Gwachaje. My grandparents were the late Sarah and Isaac John. My mother is Marlene DeRochers, and my dad was the late Bill Black. And I grew up on the Yukon River with my family at fish camp, and you'll see little Jessica in the picture. And then fast forward about, I want to say 5 years ago, there's a picture from our fish camp at 3 in the morning. I was jarring fish, and then with my niece and nephews and my daughter. And so that's really my grounding into this work. Growing up at fish camp, it was such a rich life. It's where I formed my identity as a Native person with my extended family. And never in my life did I imagine I would see a day where I was not allowed to fish anymore. In fact, the fish were so plentiful. My late grandfather built fish wheels, and we had such an amazing life on the banks of the Yukon River. And then in this fish camp picture, you can see the happiness that exudes my nieces and my daughter's faces as we harvest salmon. So such a rich life, but things have changed drastically. So I focus a lot of my work on what is it about fishing that makes us well as Native people, and why is it important that tribes who are sovereign governments have a say in natural stewardship or culture stewardship decisions. So my background is I'm a proud UAF alum. I got my bachelor's here, and then I got my master's and PhD at Washington University in St. Louis. So a little bit about me, but you'll hear more as we go through.
Thank you, Jess. And to share some photos from my lens, I want to introduce my mother, Ruth Carothers, who may be Zooming or listening on Facebook. She's on the left there with my daughters, Sola and Annika, and my late dad. He passed away a few years ago and just really left a huge hole in our family and community. But I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. These are the homelands of the Adena, Hopewell, and many other Indigenous peoples that I did not grow up learning about in public education. It really was in my 30s that I started to understand the history of where I grew up in a working class community in Pittsburgh, but it's been something that I'm undertaking and trying to understand that history and really trying to center raising my girls, recognizing where they're growing up in Anchorage, that's Dena'ina land, some of the history that brought us there, that brought our family there. How do we live in good relationship? What are our ethical responsibilities to the people and the place, as well as where I come from, Pittsburgh? And so that's something I carry through in a lot of my daily life in addition to my professional work. I want to acknowledge, as I mentioned, Mary Hawkinson is the elder pictured at the top there. She welcomed me into her home shortly after her husband had passed away, and it was an amazing, intimate, deep relationship that we had. I was her banya buddy, the Russian steam bath in Old Harbor. Every night we'd call, Courtney wants a banya, can you light banya? And so we got really close, and her daughter Phyllis Clough is like a sister to me. And so I just want to acknowledge their entire family, and including Freddie Christensen, who has been an elder mentor for many of our projects for many years, and the village of Old Harbor is pictured there below. And so I came into this work as a very naive student studying anthropology, a discipline that I don't really identify with anymore because of its colonial legacy and continued struggle with studying on instead of studying with. And so I really mention that in part because I think it is part of my scholarship to be reflecting on that shift and trying to guide other students who have great interest in social sciences. I love social science. I love ethnography as a methodology, but the sort of position of like going to some remote place, taking knowledge, writing up a dissertation and like never returning is just is not ethical. So I want to acknowledge Old Harbor and all of the amazing guidance I got very early in my career. And we've been studying, the folks there have been living, but we've been studying for 30 years, 20 years for me, but Dr. Steve Langdon, some other mentors much longer, about really bad fisheries policy that has dispossessed communities like Old Harbor from their small-scale mixed subsistence and commercial livelihoods. And we have, I've published probably 30 papers on this topic. I have piles of data on this topic. Absolutely objective science to suggest the policies have been ill-fitted and ill-suiting for those communities, and there's been zero movement. That dominant story of the problem is the people, not the policies, like it's completely false from a scientific point of view, but it's persistent. And the reason it's persistent is kind of why we're getting to Tamamta. There's deep structural, institutional, interpersonal, colonial, and racism that persists, and it's really hard to get into those topics. But I think I put this picture of Dr. Black and I. We were invited, the village of Kequan, Lagunai, Liz Medicine Crow, and her community of Cake invited us to paddle with them on canoe journeys last summer before last. And this was a picture of us on one of the beaches there. And I put this picture on there because I wanted to sort of reflect on, as a way of introduction, how important this work is in our positionality. Like, I'm a non-native person, I'm a settler scholar. I don't really want to be leading this work because it should be led by Indigenous brilliance and mentorship and guidance. But the amount of weight that Dr. Black carries, that Dr. Stern carries, that Janessa carries, that so many of our Indigenous colleagues in this work carry makes it such that I want to roll up my sleeves and help do some of this work. And so Peter and I and other allies, Julia, Isaac, other non-native allies in this work are trying to find our role. Donna, what's the appropriate role that we can play in helping some of this transformative work? Because it's not for Native people alone to be doing this work. It absolutely takes all of us. So just want to appreciate everyone, time for letting us deeply introduce some of what brings us to this work, because it's so important, I think, to why we've had some success, because we have deep relational trust and camaraderie. So thank you.
Thank you, Courtney. So I just wanted to honor the work of Dr. Ray Barnhart and the late Dr. Oscar Coagley, who were prolific in a lot of the writing around Indigenous scholarship. And I had an honor of taking Dr. Coagley's class. And I just remember feeling as a young Indigenous person like, wow, this is so amazing that, I get to take a class with an Indigenous scholar who's saying the things I grew up learning. And it just felt so validating. And so I brought this quote: Indigenous peoples throughout the world have sustained their unique worldviews and associated knowledge systems for millennia, even while undergoing great social upheavals as a result of transformative forces beyond their control. And I love this quote because to me, it speaks to so many things within a few words. And I think about the long-term stewardship of my own peoples and the connection to place. And that matters because, growing up, we would hear stories from our elders and our aunties and uncles of like the long-term. Those weren't the words they would say. We've been here a long time. We've always had relationships with the land and the animals. They take care of us. These teachings that I grew up knowing. And despite this long-term stewardship, 10,000 plus years, Alaska Native peoples have been largely left out of many governing decisions that fundamentally impact our ways of life. And when you think about not only in governing systems, but within institutions of higher education. Walking into classrooms around fisheries or wildlife biology, and I think it's getting better, I do, partly because of some of this work, but the work of many of you, recognizing the importance of bringing in different knowledge systems, bringing elders into the classroom to ensure that these governing systems, these long-term knowledge systems, educational systems are not erased from curriculum. And so it's complex, and I don't think I have to overly state that, but I will state that management is a complex web of many different bodies, and making it very difficult to work your way into those management bodies and make change. It depends on where you're fishing or what species or what time of the year, whether you're on federal or state land. And so it's very difficult for Native or Indigenous peoples to continue our ways of life if we have these very difficult systems to interface with, and we're watching in real time some of the collapses of our fisheries, Chinook, chum, and then added to that pressure is some of our other species, moose or caribou, may also be suffering. And so it creates this really stark reality that is difficult, because it's not just about that physical food that we eat. It is our spiritual and cultural ways of life that are deeply impacted. And it's even hard for me to stand up here and talk about, a collapse of a fishery that's so near and dear to my heart, but there's no other way to put it. I have to be honest with you. It's been 4 years since I fished, and to me, when I have to look at our children and tell them we're doing our best, but we don't see the movement, it becomes something I get very passionate about and something I want to see change. And there are ways to transform and change, which is why we're here. I wanted to just give a few statistics that subsistence fishing only accounts for 1% of the overall fisheries take, while commercial, sport, and personal use fisheries account for 98 to 99%. Again, our well-being is intimately tied to our ability to hunt, fish, and gather and provide for one's family and community. And sharing is a huge part of this. I don't remember who did the study, but I saw a really amazing paper. And in the paper, the person had mapped out through, it's a methodology, but the nodes of sharing around the state, and the bigger the node, the more sharing that exists. There are trading networks. And it was just amazing how much sharing of subsistence food existed across the state of Alaska. But not amazing, because that is part of our value system. So, it's the ability to share, provide for one's community and family, but also to share with others. And then I wanted to recognize that in Alaska, we have over 200 federally recognized tribes who are sovereign, and equity must be central in governance in order to rectify some of the inequities. And part of that is recognizing and inviting tribal governments to the table in these decisions. Just let you read this quote, or actually maybe I should just read it for the folks online, although you can see this. Without subsistence, Alaska Native peoples would die spiritually, die emotionally, and eventually die physically. There's no issue more important to achieving racial harmony in the state than protecting the subsistence way of life for rural Alaskans. And this was a quote by Governor Tony Knowles, so it's been a while, but this was after the series of Katie John cases. So, we're still contending with some of these very difficult issues. And then I want to say that, we are here at UAF, we are really committed to transforming the culture of academia, science, and research. And part of that transformation within Tamamta is elevating Indigenous knowledge. As intact knowledge systems, plural, alongside Western science. So of course I believe in Western science and the value of, different disciplines. I am a scientist, but I also believe in my Indigenous knowledge that I was raised with and the close relationship with the land. So, ensuring that Indigenous knowledge has its rightful place within academia. UAF is a proud leader in Alaska Native and Indigenous studies and Arctic research. I think, under the leadership of Dr. Stern and others, many of you in the room, we are elevating Indigenous knowledge, bringing experts and scholars to the table, co-designing projects and being stewarded by tribal governments who are telling us what sort of research is needed. So we recognize that, there's a lot of work yet to do, but we also recognize that it's imperative to elevate Indigenous knowledge to solve some of these very complex global challenges. And this graph at the very bottom, you can see this time span of 14,000 plus years of Indigenous stewardship in the blue, and then like the 200 years of more recent Western and colonial management systems. And again, it just speaks to why wouldn't we bring these knowledge systems to these decisions, to these very complex issues? It seems so common sense, but it has been a struggle in the past, which is why we're doing some of this work.
So we came together, Jessica and I, Peter Wesley, Charlene Stern, 5 years ago or so, to write this amazing grant that got funded through NSF. The National Science Foundation is funding this work based on transforming graduate education, but also to transform research processes, and we hope the governance systems. So we had a kind of moment of recognition that some of the research I was doing in understanding fishing policy and some of the research that Jessica was doing around understanding this close link between traditional ways of life and well-being and criminalization of subsistence practices and these sort of things really aligned on this key inequity that Alaska Native peoples are still enduring in these colonial management systems. We also had a recognition of representational equity, which is just sort of the tip of the iceberg here. But for example, our college, the College of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences at UAF, when we put this grant in, 2% of our graduate student body identified as Alaska Native. The population overall is about 20% Alaska Native, and at UAF undergraduate, 22% or so. So this was a stark figure. We also had the Alaska Department of Fish and Game write a letter of support for our proposal and shared with us, I think it was Alaska Workforce Profile from 2019, that shows all state agencies, I think, struggle with representational equity with regard to Alaska Native employees. But Alaska Department of Fish and Game is 50% less Alaska Native employees than any other state agency. So to us, that was a striking point of why is this? And we started to understand that the education that we're providing is not welcoming to Indigenous students, because I, again, as a non-Native person here, had I can remember these aha moments of sitting in a classroom on Trothieta campus with, Koyukon Athabaskan students in the room speaking about their river and their fishery and never acknowledging the 14,000 plus years of their governance systems, of their stewardship systems, of their relational care that they've provided the fish and the land, and just had this, realization that some deep transformation was needed. And so we came together to stand up a program that really, centers a different kind of approach. So we're trying to draw upon both indigenizing approaches and decolonizing approaches. And we use these two quotes from Queen's University because they sort of capture the heart of this. Indigenizing is really about centering Indigenous worldviews, not tokenistically recognizing Indigenous knowledge as something to add into science, but to recognize that the whole worldview, practices, structures, everything really should be centering Indigenous people, worldviews, knowledge systems, governance practices, cultural protocols that are quite different from Western ones. And decolonizing, it's such an important thing for us, like in the discipline of fisheries or anthropology or many of the other Western disciplines that many of you may come from, that our whole way of knowing, and really the university system is sort of based on this Western European way of validating knowledge, way of making things hierarchical, way of getting approval, and it's a really effective system, but that it's not universal, it's not the only one, it's one of many. And so just removing that kind of need to be the best or to sort of assimilate other ways into this is part of that work of decolonizing. So just really understanding that what is a Western approach and not assuming that it's better. We really center in this work, as Jessica mentioned, tribal sovereignty. So tribes in Alaska, the 229 tribal governments, have sovereign powers just like a foreign nation does, like another country. And so recognizing tribes as political sovereign entities is really important for the work that we do in research, education, and governance. And so we just put a few quotes here from a recent document that the White House put out in 2022, because we hear things a lot in like our seminars or in classes that is not true. And it's really nice to have federal guidance that federal agencies should recognize and apply Indigenous knowledge. Agencies or Western science does not need to judge, validate, or evaluate Indigenous knowledge. That's not appropriate to do that. Indigenous knowledge is best available science. It doesn't have to be assessed in any way. And really importantly, and this is, again, some of the hard part of this work, is the recognition that Western science has been used as a tool of oppression in Alaska and throughout the United States. And that's an important point because we can't start from a place in 2024 without the recognition of that history. White settlers like myself have never maybe needed to know that history, but Indigenous people have lived that through their families, through boarding schools, through really bad medical studies. The legacy of research is something that's really important to this work, that if that's a new topic, it's important to read up on. We also note that the National Science Foundation has recently revised their procedures to make sure that any research with tribal nations includes their express consent, and that's something at UAF we're hoping to also model that. Many tribal coalitions around the state have been requesting the National Science Foundation to uplift tribal priorities for research. They have a program called Navigating the New Arctic, which is offensive to many Indigenous people because the Arctic is their homelands. It's a place they know deeply about and really should be guiding the expertise on that topic. So we want to also recognize another guiding foundation for this work is the recognition of pluralism. So we have this really awesome figure from Dr. Andrea Reid. She's a Nisga'a scholar from British Columbia who visited actually with Tamamta this past year. So this figure shows sort of the status quo of Western science kind of being the dominant worldview. In the middle there is Western science, maybe with the inclusion of a little bit of Indigenous knowledge, but assimilating that into basically the status quo system, which we sort of maybe have in some of our fisheries right now. But the goal here is really to uplift Indigenous knowledge system as its own equally valid, inherently standing alone with its own protocols and methodologies to work alongside Western science and to not really integrate or assimilate. And so this is some of the stuff I nerd out on is looking at things like the nature of reality, how we know what we know, some of these like deep reflective thoughts in the social sciences about it's really hard to understand this work if you don't understand that fish, to Jessica's people, are a relative. They're a sentient relative. They have complete agency. They determine if they're going to come to your fish net because of how you've treated them or how your ancestors treated them, how you've cared for them in the past. They are in charge. That's so different from a Western approach that assumes people are in charge. We can predict how the salmon are going to come back. We manage them. It's a very different understanding. And so to come up with a governance system that respects Indigenous ontology or in epistemology and respects Western, you have to recognize that difference. You can't conflate them into the same because they're totally different worldviews. So that to us is so important because right now in our mainstream education, research and governance systems, there is not a recognition of this pluralism. So just recognizing it would be an incredibly huge step forward in our view.
So we want to talk a little bit about Tamamta, a project that we're very proud of and that we've learned a lot as we've navigated it together as scholars. As Courtney mentioned, Charlene and Peter, all of us have done deep relational work amongst ourselves to make this work be the best it could be, because we really honor our fellows and them, coming to UAF, and we want to ensure their experience is honoring that pluralism and bringing their whole selves to the program. So we have 3 overarching goals: to transform graduate education in fisheries and marine sciences, provide supportive program for the next generation of Indigenous and allied scientists and managers, and engaging in decolonizing and indigenizing approaches across UAF and our partners. And to the second point, I wanted to just mention, I saw a statistic somewhere, but I don't know if it's exactly right. So I'm prefacing what I'm about to say with that, and I need to dig into it a little bit more. But a very high percentage of graduates from the School of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences go on to management positions in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or Alaska Department of Fish and Game. And so if you think about providing support for our next generation of scholars, we're hoping to transform the way we work with these agencies and the work that they do so it can be more inclusive of these different knowledge systems and worldviews. So, we want to provide support, and we'll talk a little bit about how we do that, but, we want to transform education also to be more equitable because as Courtney mentioned, teaching these fisheries classes, I operate in a little bit of a different realm because I work within our rural college, and I teach primarily Alaska Native Studies and Rural Development courses. So a lot of my content is Indigenous based, and just because of who I am. But we're really looking at transformation here. I want to honor our fellows. We have 3 cohorts, 19 fellows. And every time I see this picture, it just gives me goosebumps to see all of their pictures, because I know each one of them, and I know all of the knowledge that they have carried to this program to make it what it is from their parents, from their grandparents, from their ancestors, and it has created an amazing group of people doing amazing work and also deeply, deeply transforming our institution for the better. So I want to recognize Janessa, who's in the room. Thank you for coming tonight. But each of the scholars, if any of you are online, hello to each of you. But doing amazing work with their communities and within their communities, and on different topics that are very, very interesting and transformative. We also have a project team and affiliated faculty that is growing exponentially. And you can see just from the profile pictures on the top, we have our leads team, that's what we call it, who meet weekly to really dig into this work, the work we're doing with each other. And then this next 2 rows are affiliated faculty who have leaned into this work. Did you want to share a little bit?
Yeah, and just to acknowledge as well, Dr. Sonia Ibarra is not in the room. That's why we haven't mentioned her earlier, but she's also one of our leads, an amazing postdoctoral fellow and program coordinator. She's pictured there in the top row. And then, we've got Dr. Donna Hauser, Dr. Kay McGonigal. Is there anyone else in the audience from our affiliated faculty? It's really good to see some of you. We are really and I want to mention again Dr. Peter Wesley's leadership on setting up an accountable allies group as part of our Tamamta affiliated faculty. We've heard from our fellows that it's really amazing to lean into this work, but sometimes we're still observing kind of harmful behaviors or things that probably aren't even apparent to those non-Native faculty that are leaning into this. So we're doing some deep work with ourselves, in our families, in our lives. It's really kind of become all-encompassing, but because we all really believe in this work. So just want to honor as well how many people have shown up to lean into this work and join Tamamta. We are hosting a lot of, trying to pull a lot off with a relatively small team. Dr. Black and I have developed a new course, the first course in our fisheries program, Indigenous Fisheries of Alaska. It's the first course that's focused on any Indigenous content, so we're really excited and so appreciate Jessica co-teaching that class in addition to everything else that she's got on her plate. We've been having elders, we have a steering committee, Indigenous steering committee, and elders who have been part of our classes, been part of our retreats. We have a visiting scholars program. I mentioned Dr. Andrea Reed visited with us. We've been doing these deep retreats, so that some of the pictures you've seen there at Howard Luke's camp there, just really getting to know each other, camping out together, making meals together, having hard conversations. That's another part of our process that I'll speak to in a minute. And then also visual representations. This is a beautiful painting called Tamamta by Abayuk Moore, a Yupik artist who also made our beautiful logo. And just wanting to really understand Indigenous representation, like in our building, our fisheries building doesn't have any Indigenous art, and our visual representation on our website really needs to be much more inclusive. So we're working on that. We want to acknowledge First Alaskans Institute trained some of us even before Tamamta started to host difficult dialogues around racism and racial equity in fisheries. And so this is a word cloud of a dialogue we hosted at one of our salmon meetings back in 2014. I still remember that. It was like we were super stressed to host it. It was, who wants to talk about racism in fisheries? It's a hard topic. And it was we had a lot of pushback in all kinds of ways. And you can see this word cloud from the notes, like a lot of fear, a lot of not talking, a lot of defensiveness, a lot of just, not really getting into it. But through time and learning more and having people lean in more, we've gotten to a place where we are able to have these dialogues. This was a picture. We thought we would have about 30 people show up for this American Fisheries Society dialogue last year, and we had 100 people or so. There's a hunger for having these conversations. They are difficult. I will acknowledge that we have learned in our team these dialogues come at a cost to some Indigenous participants, particularly our students, and so we're understanding and the need for deepening some of this work with our allies in this space. So this is kind of hard, and we're not shying away from it, but we also want to acknowledge we've learned, and that's one of the pieces of guidance again that I want to share as a non-Native person in this space of feeling afraid to make a mistake and like, this isn't my work. I don't want to step in a wrong way, or I don't want to make a mistake. The guidance I've consistently gotten is we need you in this work, and it's okay to make a mistake, and we're going to tell you what's wrong. Like, don't actively try to make mistakes, but we need you in this work. And so if you're, on the fence, I'm a plant biologist, I don't really know if this means anything to me, like it absolutely means something, and absolutely everyone really, we hope, will reflect on this in some way and join in. Just want to share a few thoughts from our fellows that to a fellow, we have, I think 90% of our fellows are Indigenous, and we have a couple of non-Indigenous allied fellows. Those who come from Indigenous identities and positionalities to a fellow have mentioned Tamamta is one of the first places in their academic and even K-12 where they felt they could bring their Indigenous identity in through the classroom doorway. And it's really heartbreaking to hear that, but it's I guess validating that Tamamta's created a space where that's welcomed. So you can read a little bit of the quotes here, but really focusing again on this need to really deeply transform and uplift Indigenous knowledge systems to make space. are doing a lot of work in our college, and particularly with our Department of Fisheries. I think we did a recent survey, and I don't have the statistic in here, but it was 90% of our College of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences faculty are supportive of the work that we're doing. And that's great. I'm really excited about that. Half of the folks weren't part of our program, and so it shows there's a general consensus of the need for this kind of change. We did include this because I think it's an important indicator of the general feeling for change. We have UAF Fisheries faculty strongly agreeing that they support an increased role for tribal governance of fisheries in Alaskan marine systems, that they are neutral and tending toward disagreeing that these systems are well managed and well governed, and disagreeing that these management systems are fair. I didn't do this 10 years ago, so I don't have the data, but I'm pretty sure these numbers wouldn't have looked this way 10 years ago. We couldn't even say the word tribe in our college 10 years ago. It was not anywhere on our website. It was in that anytime you state federal, and we would sort of add in tribal, and that would just sort of be erased. And so in fisheries, there has not been a space to acknowledge the existence of tribes and tribal knowledge. And so this, to me, is an indicator of growth and movement. And one more, I want to put a plug in for our website, tamamta.org. We have a events tab on that website. We also have a mailing list. If you want to join our listserv, we share a lot of material, not a lot, but enough materials there. We have these 3 videos that Kindia Labs produced for us on some background. If you're interested, these are short 3-minute videos on Alaska Native hunting and fishing history, equity in fisheries, how science could maybe shift a bit. We also have recordings of racial equity dialogues. We've hosted elders visiting with our program and seminars. And so we included a quote here as well, talking about the importance of this work in education. So there's folks sharing they really learned a lot, and a lot of this had been invisible to them. And so if you're feeling that way, you might check out this events tab on our website.
Yeah, so I also wanted to share, we have been recognized, and this isn't really to like pat ourselves on the back, but just to let you know that, there is this hunger for learning and growing, and we've been recognized for our deep relational work and community-based work. So Dr. Sonia Ibarra was recognized for her Indigenous excellence in research with the work she's done in Southeast with several tribes. And we're so proud of the work she's continuing to do. She's our program coordinator, but she's also a scholar and has done some really transformative work. We've also been recognized by the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities, and so Courtney was accepted an award on her behalf down in Seattle. And then Kimberly Pickuk, who is a Tamamta scholar, was recognized as one of the 50 people changing the world that the world needs to know about from the Explorers Club. So lots of growing recognition, but mainly in the spirit of we're coming at this very humbly, but like there is this hunger for this type of transformative work. I'm going to switch gears briefly. I recognize that we have about, is it 10 minutes or 15 minutes? Okay, so there's time. Great, thank you. So I wanted to recognize some of, we've been in this work a long time together, Courtney and I and Peter. We started, my daughter was not born yet, so about 9 years ago, we were part of a project that Courtney and Peter brought me into, funded by the Moore Foundation, the State of Alaska Salmon and People Project. You can look that up. There's lots of data out there if you are interested. It's a synthesis group, and there was scientists from all disciplines. We had a governance, a well-being, we had biophysical, you name it. There was like a really diverse body of people coming together to look at salmon, the state of salmon in Alaska, and a lot of data was documented at the State of Alaska Salmon and People Project. But from that work, we grew our relationships, and Courtney and I, with guidance from some of the elders we worked with and students who also recommended, this is very interesting. We need this work. We wrote a National Science Foundation grant for what we call Indigenizing Salmon Science and Management. And it documents the breadth and depth of Indigenous knowledge, values, and governing systems connected to salmon across the state of Alaska, and utilizes this wisdom to improve current salmon science and management for all. And so what has been really unique, it's ongoing, is it's Indigenous-led, so I am the principal investigator, but several of our graduate students, our undergrads, our graduate students are co-leading the project in their own communities. We have utilized Indigenous methodologies of circle dialogues, multi-generational interviews, so something like a grandparent, a parent, and a young person being interviewed together, and pretty soon the interviewer becomes obsolete. Pretty soon they're talking amongst each other, multi-generational learning occurring. They're directing the interview, youth engagement, and then some traditional methodologies of, semi-directed interviews, qualitative coding, and community visits. But I think what I'm most proud of this project is that a lot of the students are leading the work in their own regions, and they're making the science better. And I'm also proud of this project because I always say it helped to birth Tamamta. So from that data, we were able to also write Tamamta. And these are just some powerful quotes from that data around well-being. And there's a lot within these quotes. It's very emotional, but centered in this quote, I'll let you read it for a second. And if you can't see it, it'll be recorded and you can rewatch it if you want. But in this quote, it really talks about well-being is so central. And from our hunting, fishing, and gathering lifestyle, that's where the well-being exists. And without fishing and hunting, that's not well-being. And there is a cost that our children, as my nieces and nephews and my daughter, if they don't get to experience this life, what does that mean to us? It's such a central part of our identity. Tribal sovereignty showed up, especially with some of the moratoriums, but also like the inability to fish and, the criminalization of subsistence has been very hard on our communities. And then the need for Indigenous stewardship, as we mentioned, the long-term stewardship and care and passing down, knowledge from our elders and our ancestors. And I always share this with people, Indigenous stewardship doesn't mean like I have all the rights and I have everything and everybody else gets nothing. Very inherent within our cultures is sharing. And so I like to make that point because I think we live in a society that sometimes, there's lots of divisiveness. And so, people think sometimes in that way. I'm not going to say everybody, but, there's this tendency, well, if you have the rights, then I don't, and I don't have that access. And that's not what we're advocating for. We're advocating for an elevation of an equity and that long-term knowledge and stewardship and care be present. So I just want to call that out because I feel like that's kind of like there can be some feelings around that. And so coming full circle, Tamamta, and that, that's what this project is really about, all of us together. So you want to share a little bit, Courtney, and I'll share
Sure. So I think thanks so much for sharing on indigenizing salmon science and management. I agree. It's been such a good foundation for so much of the work and really an honor to be part of that as well. But really, want to welcome all of you that have listened here today. Thank you so much for joining us to think about what this means, Tamamta, really taking all of us to ensure both Western and Indigenous sciences are incorporated into our education, research, and governance systems, honoring the sovereignty and long-term stewardship of Alaska's Indigenous people, that's such a foundation. We really can't start without that. We can all work to build meaningful relationships, conducting tribally driven research, working hand in hand with tribes and communities. And this is, again, I think something at UAF with Indigenous leadership, working to really normalize and institutionalize how we should be working with tribes and not putting burdens on tribes, but to recognize their sovereign nations who either consent or don't, and really should be directing what research is done, serving tribal priorities, making space to learn from each other through dialogues and through collaboration. And really, at UAF, we're hoping we are a global leader, hoping to further become a global leader in how to be centering indigenizing and decolonizing approaches. And so we hope that spreads throughout higher education, but also to our state, federal, tribal, community, local partners. And so if you're intrigued on any of those topics, we really welcome you to visit with us, join our listserv, be in good relation with all of us.
Yeah, and I would just say that, we can all make space within our own lives, whether that's our small circles, our families, our university communities, to engage in these deep conversations, which aren't always comfortable, but I will say, are very important. And there is something that happens when you are in a circle, or even just within like your own small family, if you're at home around the dinner table, of just engaging in these deep and meaningful conversations and collaborating in a meaningful way that honors the long-term knowledge and stewardship, your Indigenous collaborators have, and working on community and tribal priorities in a very authentic way. And so I think from those very small at the beginning to growing, which we talked about, there was over 100 people at the American Fisheries Society dialogue. We were not prepared, but it went very well. We grew relationships from that dialogue that moved into, deeper conversations. And so it's ongoing work, and I don't want anyone to leave feeling like, where do I start? Sometimes it just starts with a conversation and a commitment to doing better work together. So Tamamta. And with that, we will say Masicho, Koyana, Basi, thank you for coming, and recognize our sponsors in this work and funders and all our collaborators. So thank you. And at this time, we're happy to take questions. Is that fair? Yeah? Okay. And we have some mics.
Yeah, so happy to pass the mic around and take any questions in the room.
Don't be shy.
If we're slow to start, I do have a question. Thank you. That was a wonderful presentation. We really appreciate both of your time. Can you tell us a little bit about the research projects that your students or that your fellows are working on right now? Just a sample of those projects?
Yeah, so maybe I can start and you can join in. So we have, for indigenizing salmon science and management, we have students that have led and are leading work in the Kuskokwim River watershed, the Yukon River watershed, Kodiak, Bristol Bay. Am I missing anything? Oh yeah, and Metlakatla. So they're leading research generally around those larger questions that indigenizing salmon science and management have focused on, but in relationship with their tribe and community. So, if, for example, their tribe wants to go a different direction, of course, that is supported and encouraged. But, those are the different areas. And Janessa Esquible, who is one of our Tamamta fellows, she is a doctoral candidate. She led many, many interviews, multi-generational dialogues in the Kuskokwim River watershed. She worked with many tribal governments to better understand Indigenous governance, what that looked like historically, contemporary, in relationship with community. And she has a paper that's published that I'm happy to send to you, Becky, if folks are interested in reading it, but you could also look her up on Google Scholar. So those are some of the examples. And then for Tamamta, maybe I'll let you speak to a couple of the projects.
Sure, yeah, we have a lot of breadth in what students are studying and also approaches that we're using. We have some students using, primarily an Indigenous worldview and lens. Verne's working with her community in Wales and in Inupiaq spirituality and how that is central to governance practices for Inupiaq peoples. Kimberly Kivak-Pikak, also part of the AOK community, is working with her community in Utqiagvik, bridging Western and Indigenous approaches to understanding the key role that whaling has played in culture and well-being, and is doing a really amazing documentary filmmaking with her brother as part of that work, and using a lot of observational data going back decades to look at some climate change in her community. Tasia Wagner, one of our fellows based in Metlakatla, is been working for several years to start a good process of Metlakatla fishermen being able to tell their story of their experiences with the limited entry salmon program. Metlakatla runs the largest tribal fishery in the US, but they also were impacted by state policies that, in fact, if you delivered to the cannery in Metlakatla, your landings did not count for a state permit. I still can't believe that is legal. It doesn't seem legal to me, but she's uncovering a lot of the tension there. And these are hard stories to talk about. Fishermen, these are deep wounds that have happened. Fathers not being able to give their permits to sons because they needed money and had to sell a high value asset. So there's a lot of going on with regard to that work in terms of fisheries policy. Keith Herron's doing really interesting work looking at fish health from a Western lens of looking at ichthyophonus and working with veterinary scholars to figure out ways that you could actually test for ichthyophonus without killing the fish. So really interesting innovation, but also visiting with tribes, working with tribes to think about what are the key areas of fish health that tribes are interested in collecting and how they view it from their Indigenous knowledge. So I could pull up the slide where I've got everyone's fellow's face, so sorry for not mentioning every single project, but a lot of work in community and really being led in a good way.
Any other questions in the room? Like Becky, I also have some questions, but I can say some online questions first and give those people a chance. So from Donna on Zoom, I would like to understand what relationship UAF and the Tamamta program has with the state of Alaska to advance a more integral and sustainable relationship to advance integration of Indigenous values into applicable stewardship practices within the scientific approach to merge values into the future.
Yeah, I can start and then you can add. So we are trying to mature relationships that we have with state partners. I would say we have some relationship with Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and we have, it's been really nice. Some employees have come to some of our dialogues. We have students in our classes from the department and have sort of started to think about, ways to partner more. There is the Board of Fisheries right now is having discussions around how to best include traditional knowledge into some of their science informing policy processes. And so our fellows, Natasha Hayden, Janessa Squible, others, Janessa, I think a lot of others have been informing how that should go. And so I see some of our fellows and faculty helping to give guidance. We're doing this also with NOAA Fisheries, and not in a sort of we're the experts way, but just there isn't actually a lot of expertise in some of the natural resource management entities. It's in issues of equity and Indigenous knowledge. And so that's a gap that we are trying to help provide expertise to think about moving forward in a good way. So there's a lot of room to grow that relationship. And I'd say right now we're focused on this educational shift that we, and sort of a longer term filters through to, having folks like our fellows will become the next generation of managers. And so we're hopeful to see quite transformative work when that happens. But in the interim, we're still building and forging those partnerships.
Right, thank you. And from Rachel on Zoom, and Rachel provided some pronunciation support, so I'm going to do my best. Kuyan Achuknuk for the presentation. Appreciate you both and how you have carried this project over the years in the right way. I was wondering regarding equity, how are you bridging that with management? What does equity in fisheries management look like, and how do we get there?
Thank you, Rachel. And Guyana, and I would say that, some of the things that we have touched upon that Courtney just shared is, what does it look like at these governing bodies? Are there tribally designated seats, or do they lie mainly within advisory roles? So really pushing on some of those points and questions. I think we talked a lot today about equity in education, what that looks like, because we are on, a campus here, and we are scientists, so we're very interested in how education either does or does not include Indigenous knowledge systems, plural, as their own intact knowledge systems, because it's, I think, easy to generalize Indigenous knowledge as one thing, but it's many different knowledge systems, very place-based. Equity in management systems is, in my view, is Indigenous stewardship over fisheries, and that long-term knowledge and stewardship, and there's deep relations. So I think that is really, a also very important step, but there's many ways it could look, and I think, as I mentioned in the slide deck, it's complex because we've been so fractionated too. If you look even at a map of Alaska and look at who owns what lands, are they federal lands? Are they state lands? Are they individually owned, tribally owned? Are they corporate lands? And then what management body oversees those lands, we become very fractionated. And so it's difficult, again, to enter into those systems and I think, ensure that there's adequate representation and equity in all of those diverse systems. It's just so much work to do. And so I think with equity is ensuring that there are tribally designated seats on each of those bodies. And, we haven't even talked about some of the other, marine mammals. There's so much there. And so, it becomes really a lot to think about, but we are pushing for equity, and a lot of times people will share with us, well, you can go testify for 3 minutes to make your point, or you can serve as an advisory role. But we're we talked about tribal sovereignty and tribal governments. There should be these seats at the table, recognized seats, and that's some of the ways that I see it, and I'll just speak for myself as a tribal person, with knowing that my peoples have 10,000 plus years of stewardship on these lands. So, thank you, Guyana.
Any other questions in the room?
My question is regarding maybe how people outside of the academia world get more educated on this, and how we can help use our voices maybe by voting. So if you guys have any outreach or any resources that we can look to when we're trying to use our voice and our voting, how we can help.
Yeah, thanks so much for that question and comment. The events tab that we put up there has a couple 3 short videos that I think are really a good place to start in terms of education on some of the basic inequities that do exist. And I think that as Jessica said, a really key part of moving towards equity is just the recognition of tribal sovereignty in Alaska, and that's been recognized at the state level, it's recognized at the federal level, but yet when you start to get into some of these management bodies, it's unclear that folks there are really recognizing that. So for me, that's and for Jess, as she said, a really key part of always upholding tribal sovereignty is a part. And then we have, as part of this Accountable Allies group and some of the work that we're doing in our college and many other institutions and groups are doing similar things. We have a lot of collection of references that we hope to make public facing through our Fisheries college. So that's something that we will be sharing out if that's one source, but there's many I'd say resources online if sort of searching around some of these issues around structural racism, institutional racism, colonial history, and would be happy to take your email and share things directly if anyone wants to come up after or join our listserv where we share things out. But thanks for the question. It's so important this really does, I think, touch on so much more than just fisheries, and so really appreciate you bringing up how to be an actively educated citizen in voting and decision making, because it's so important. So thank you.
I had a question. So I was really struck when you mentioned that the word tribe or tribal was removed from your website, for instance, and how things have changed in the past 10 years and how we have Tratheta on our campus signs. And so do you see those improvements to be some key people that are driving that, some key events, or is it just kind of over time people have been working hard and kind of pushing things individually and now we're getting to this better place?
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in here. I think both, a lot of, I think Charlene and I both stand on the shoulders of many of our leaders who have been really pushing this. Who came to mind immediately was the late Bernice Joseph, who was our vice chancellor of our Royal College, who really was pushing transformative education. But I mentioned Dr. Oscar Coagli and Dr. Ray Barnhart, and just there's so many people who have been engaged in this work for such a long time that we stand on their shoulders. But also I just want to recognize my boss, not because she's my boss, but also just as a person, a leader with lots of integrity, but also not afraid to push those very important things that mean a lot to us Indigenous scholars and students and staff that, as in her role at the more administrative level, that really garner that traction. And I think you do have to have key leaders. And I think that's what pushes me to do some of this work is all of my students who may feel like they don't have a voice within a class to push these things because they don't want to be graded unfairly or it's only them in a class of 20, 40, and so it's always being that voice is that within my role is I can say these things and push these things, and yes, people may not agree with me, but I need to be able to be strong and bold and say these things so that my students have a better experience in that their whole selves can show up in the classroom and be honored for all of the who they are as people. So I think it takes, the leaders, the bold leaders, and also recognizing Courtney as an ally. We do work very closely together because there are things that she can say that people will listen to, or there's things that I can say that people will listen to. And so I think together we've really built a strong friendship and relationship, and but also we've together been, unified in the messaging that we're bringing forward. And with Peter, we've really grown this work, and I think it grew a lot faster than we could have ever imagined because there is the hunger to learn more and to be, from a lot of our allies, how to be a better ally, and from Indigenous scholars just, happy to engage in the work. So I think it's been growing very quickly, and we've had to slow down a few times to just, make sure that we're doing it with good intentions. And but it does take leaders to be bold, even if it's not always easy. Yeah.
Right, in the interest of time, I'm going to say again, thank you so much for your inspiring work and for speaking for our talk series. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you to everybody online.